Story number 1. The Loop on Highway 50. Robert Hayes had been driving 18-wheelers for 37 years, hauling everything from produce to heavy machinery across 48 states. In all that time, nothing prepared him for what happened on Highway 50 in Nevada during the third week of May in 2023. Robert was a practical man, a former Marine who believed in what he could see, touch, and verify with his own two hands. That night changed everything he thought he knew about reality. The run started normally enough. Robert picked up a load of construction equipment in Sacramento, bound for a development project outside of Ely, Nevada. The manifest listed concrete mixers, scaffolding components, and welding equipment. Nothing unusual. He'd driven Highway 50, that desolate stretch they call the loneliest road in America, more times than he could count. Usually he appreciated the solitude, the endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through basin and range country, where you could drive for an hour without seeing another soul. He departed Sacramento at 4 in the afternoon, planning to make Ely by 3 in the morning with a fuel stop in Fallon. The sun was setting as he crossed into Nevada, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold. Robert had his CB radio tuned to channel 19, listening to the sparse chatter from other drivers scattered across the western states. His GPS showed clear weather ahead, no construction delays, and plenty of fuel to make his plans stop. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Around 11 at night, about 60 miles past Fallon, Robert noticed something odd. The digital clock on his dashboard read 11:14, and he was approaching mile marker 198. He'd passed this exact spot countless times before. There was a distinctive rock formation on the south side of the highway, shaped like a crouching bear that truckers used as a landmark. Robert glanced at it as he passed, then returned his attention to the road ahead. 10 minutes later, his dashboard clock still read 11:14. Robert frowned, tapping the display with his finger. Sometimes the electronics glitched, especially on older Peterbilts like his 2015 model. But when he looked up at the road, his chest tightened with confusion. There was the bear-shaped rock formation again, on his right, exactly as it had been 10 minutes earlier. He was passing mile marker 198 for the second time. Robert grabbed his CB microphone. "Breaker 19, this is Silver Rider eastbound on Highway 50. Anyone else out here seeing anything strange tonight?" Static answered him. He tried again, switching channels, but every frequency was dead air. That wasn't normal. Even on the loneliest stretches, you could usually catch some skip from distant stations, phantom conversations bouncing off the ionosphere. He checked his GPS. According to the display, he was exactly where he should be, making good time toward Ely. But the mile markers told a different story. He watched carefully as he drove, counting them off. 199, 200, 201. The numbers progressed normally for about 15 minutes. Then, without warning, he was passing mile marker 198 again. The bear-shaped rock formation. The same slight curve in the road. The same everything. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, exactly what it had shown 20 minutes ago. The trip odometer, which he'd reset in Fallon, read 112 miles. It should have been higher by now, significantly higher. He was driving, covering ground, but somehow ending up in the same place over and over again. The temperature inside the cab felt wrong, too cold for a Nevada spring night, even with the air conditioning running. Robert's breath started fogging in front of him, which made no sense. The cab heater was off, and the outside temperature, according to his dash, was still 68 degrees. But he could see his breath, white plumes in the dim glow of the instrument panel. He tried his cell phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual out here. But when he unlocked the screen, the time displayed matched his dashboard clock. 11:14. Robert stared at it, watching the seconds tick by. 11:14 and 08 seconds. 09 seconds. 0:10 seconds. Then it jumped back to 05 seconds. Time was moving, but also looping back on itself like a stuttering video file. The road ahead remained empty, a black ribbon illuminated by his headlights. No other vehicles, no lights from distant towns, nothing but sagebrush and darkness stretching to invisible horizons. Robert had driven through plenty of remote areas, had spent countless nights alone on empty highways, but this felt different. This felt wrong in a way that made his survival instincts scream. He passed mile marker 198 again, and again. Each loop seemed to take about 20 minutes, though his clocks insisted no time was passing at all. Robert started noticing small details that changed with each repetition. The first time, there was a dead jackrabbit on the shoulder near mile marker 200. The second time, it was gone. The third time, there were 2 jackrabbits alive, frozen by the roadside as if stuffed and mounted. The fourth time, they were in different positions, moving in stuttering, jerky motions like stop-motion animation. The CB radio crackled to life. "Silver Rider." The voice was his own, but older, rougher, speaking through layers of static. "Silver Rider, you need to break the pattern." Robert grabbed the microphone with shaking hands. "Who is this? How do you know my handle?" "Because I'm you," the voice responded. 37 years ahead, you're caught in a temporal eddy, a loop in space-time. The equipment you're hauling, one of the welders, is leaking exotic particles from a quantum stabilization experiment. It's creating a localized distortion. You have to stop driving forward, you have to go backward through the loop. This was insane. Robert had encountered lot lizards, meth-addled hijackers, and corrupt DOT inspectors, but nothing in his experience prepared him for hearing his own voice from the future through a CB radio. Yet the voice knew details only Robert would know. It mentioned his daughter's middle name, the scar on his left knee from Paris Island, the specific tattoo he got in Okinawa that nobody ever saw. "How do I get out?" Robert asked, his voice barely steady. "When you reach mile marker 198 this time, stop. Turn the truck around, drive backward through the loop at exactly 53 miles per hour. The welding unit is in the rear left corner of your trailer, industrial yellow casing with a black manufacturer's plate. When you reverse direction, the particle leak will create a counter-rotation that should collapse the loop. But Robert, you only get one chance. If you miss the window, you'll be stuck here forever, driving the same 20-mile stretch until your body gives out." The radio went dead. Robert approached mile marker 198 again, the bear-shaped rock formation looming in his headlights. He took a deep breath, downshifted, and brought the Peterbilt to a stop. The engine idled, a familiar rumble that was the only normal thing in this nightmare. He checked his mirrors, though there was nothing behind him but empty highway stretching into darkness. Turning an 18-wheeler around on a 2-lane highway wasn't easy, but Robert had done it before in emergency situations. He found a wide spot where the shoulder was relatively firm, took it slow, and managed to get the rig pointing back west. The whole time, his dashboard clock flickered between 11:14 and 11:15, never settling on one or the other. He started driving, accelerating to exactly 53 miles per hour according to his speedometer. The highway unreeled in reverse, mile markers counting down, 198, 197, 196. His breath was still fogging in the cold cab. The CB radio hissed with static. Then as he passed mile marker 193, everything changed. The cold vanished instantly, replaced by normal temperature. His dashboard clock jumped forward, numbers scrolling rapidly. 11:15 became 11:47 in the space of a single second, catching up to real time. The CB radio erupted with normal chatter, truckers talking about weather conditions and an accident blocking eastbound lanes near Austin. His cell phone chirped with delayed notifications, messages from his dispatcher wondering why he hadn't checked in. Robert pulled over, his hands shaking so badly he could barely shift into neutral. He sat there for 10 minutes just breathing, trying to process what had happened. When he finally climbed out to check his cargo, he found exactly what the voice had described. An industrial welding unit with a yellow casing tucked in the rear left corner. The manufacturer's plate identified it as an experimental model, part of something called the Hawking-Penrose Quantum Stabilization Initiative. There was a hairline crack in the casing and a faint blue glow emanated from within. Robert photographed it with his phone, then covered the unit with a tarp and secured it with extra straps. He completed his delivery to Ely, handed over the equipment manifest, and said nothing about the loop or the damaged welder. What would he say? That he'd been trapped in time for 37 subjective minutes while no time passed in the outside world? That he'd received instructions from his future self over a CB radio? 3 days later, driving back through the same stretch of Highway 50, Robert stopped at mile marker 198. The bear-shaped rock formation was there, unchanged. He stood beside his empty trailer in the Nevada darkness, staring at the spot where he'd been trapped in an endless loop. A light breeze carried the scent of sagebrush. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Robert never hauled experimental equipment again. He put in for early retirement 6 months later at 63 and moved to a small town in Oregon where his daughter lived. But sometimes late at night he turns on his old CB radio and listens to the chatter on Channel 19. He's waiting to hear a younger version of himself, confused and frightened, calling for help on that lonely stretch of Nevada highway. When that night comes, Robert will be ready to answer, to pass along the instructions that saved his life, to complete a loop that spans 37 years. Because that's what you do for your fellow truckers. Even when that fellow trucker is yourself, lost in time, driving through an impossible night that never ends. Story number 2. The facility that wasn't there. Patricia Sullivan discovered the facility by accident on a freezing January night in 2022, somewhere in rural Montana between Billings and Miles City. She'd been driving professionally for 22 years, and in all that time she thought she'd seen every truck stop, rest area, and back road shortcut the Northern Plains had to offer. She was wrong. The trouble started with a detour. Interstate 94 was closed due to a jackknifed tanker truck that spilled something hazardous across both lanes. Patricia was hauling refrigerated pharmaceuticals, time-sensitive cargo with strict temperature requirements, and an unforgiving delivery schedule. Sitting in gridlock for 6 hours wasn't an option. Her dispatcher had texted her coordinates for an alternate route, a county road that paralleled the interstate and would add maybe 40 minutes to her journey. Patricia took the exit, her Kenworth's headlights cutting through sheets of blowing snow. The county road was plowed but empty, a narrow strip of asphalt winding through ranch land where widely spaced buildings showed dim lights against the winter darkness. She'd driven through enough blizzards that the weather didn't particularly worry her. But something about this road felt off. The GPS kept flickering, losing satellite connection and then regaining it, showing her position jumping around erratically. 20 miles down the county road, her fuel gauge started acting strange. It dropped from half full to 1/4 full in the span of 5 minutes, which made no sense given her fuel economy. Patricia swore under her breath. If the gauge was malfunctioning, she needed to stop and manually check her tanks. The last thing she needed was to run out of diesel in the middle of a Montana blizzard. That's when she saw the lights. Not house lights or vehicle lights, but something brighter. Industrial. They appeared suddenly through the snow, a sprawling complex of buildings off to her right, maybe a 1/4 mile from the road. Patricia slowed, squinting through the blowing snow. It looked like some kind of manufacturing facility. Warehouses and office buildings arranged around a central courtyard, everything lit by brilliant sodium vapor lights that turned the falling snow orange. Her fuel gauge was now reading 1/8. Decision time. She could try to make it to the next town, 30 miles ahead according to her GPS, or she could investigate this facility and see if they had diesel or at least a phone line to call for help if her tank ran dry. Patricia pulled off the county road onto an access road she hadn't noticed before. No sign, no gate, just a paved drive leading toward those orange lights. The access road was in perfect condition, not a crack or pothole, cleared of snow despite the ongoing blizzard. Strange for such a remote location. As Patricia drove closer, more details emerged through the snow. The buildings were concrete and steel, brutalist architecture with no windows on the lower floors. Everything looked new, pristine like the facility had been constructed yesterday. But there was something wrong about the whole scene, something that made the hair on Patricia's neck stand up. No vehicles in the parking lots, no people visible anywhere, no movement except the falling snow and the steady glow of those sodium lights. The facility was enormous, at least a dozen buildings covering what must have been 50 acres, but it looked completely abandoned despite being fully powered. Patricia pulled into what appeared to be a loading area, a wide bay with overhead doors and painted lines for truck positioning. She left her engine running, set the brake, and climbed down from the cab. The cold hit her like a physical force, well below zero with the wind chill. But it wasn't just the temperature. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. The nearest building had a standard industrial door marked with a faded number. 7. Patricia knocked, then tried the handle. Unlocked. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a corridor lit by fluorescent tubes. Warm air rushed out, carrying a smell Patricia couldn't quite identify. Something chemical and organic mixed together, like a hospital crossed with a machine shop. "Hello?" Patricia called, her voice echoing down the corridor. "I need some help. Truck driver with a fuel emergency." No answer. Patricia stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded far too final. The corridor extended straight ahead for maybe 100 feet, then split into a T-intersection. The walls were bare concrete, painted institutional white. The floor was polished concrete, so clean it reflected the fluorescent lights. Everything was immaculate, sterile, utterly devoid of personality. Patricia walked forward, her boots squeaking on the polished floor. She passed several doors, all closed, all marked with numbers and letters that meant nothing to her. 7A, 7B, 7C prime. At the T-intersection, she paused. Left or right? Some instinct made her choose left. The corridor continued for another 50 feet before opening into a larger space, a laboratory or workshop of some kind. The room was filled with equipment Patricia didn't recognize. Stainless steel tanks connected by thick cables to computer consoles. Glass chambers filled with swirling mist, something that looked like a particle accelerator, a circular structure maybe 20 feet in diameter, humming with deep, subsonic vibration. And in the center of everything, a platform holding what appeared to be a truck engine, a massive Cummins diesel torn apart and reassembled with strange modifications. Glowing tubes ran through the engine block. The fuel lines were translucent, filled with liquid that pulsed with phosphorescent blue light. Patricia stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This wasn't a normal facility. This was some kind of research installation, something classified and secret, hidden in the Montana Badlands where nobody would think to look. And she'd just walked right into it. "You shouldn't be here," the voice came from behind her. Patricia spun around, her heart hammering. A man stood in the corridor wearing a white clean suit and reflective goggles that hid his eyes. He was tall, thin, with a voice that sounded oddly flat, emotionless. "I'm sorry," Patricia said, holding up her hands. "My fuel gauge is malfunctioning. I saw your lights and thought someone could help me." "This is a restricted facility," the man said, not moving from his position, blocking the corridor. "No unauthorized personnel. Permitted." "I understand. I'll leave right now. Just point me to the exit." The man tilted his head, a gesture that seemed somehow wrong, too mechanical. "You've seen the calibration chamber. You've been exposed to the resonance field. Extraction protocols must be initiated." Patricia's survival instincts kicked in. She didn't know what extraction protocols meant, but it sounded bad. She turned and ran, not back toward the corridor, but deeper into the laboratory, hoping to find another exit. The man followed, his footsteps echoing, not running, but walking at a steady, relentless pace that somehow kept him close. Patricia dodged around the equipment, looking desperately for a door, a window, any way out. The laboratory seemed to extend forever, opening into new rooms filled with more incomprehensible machinery. She ran through spaces that made no sense. Rooms where gravity felt lighter. Rooms where the walls seemed to curve and flex. Rooms that were somehow larger on the inside than the building could possibly contain. Finally, she burst through a door and found herself outside, standing in the central courtyard. Snow was falling, but the flakes drifted slowly, lazily, as if moving through syrup. Patricia ran for the main gate, her lungs burning in the cold air. Behind her, multiple figures in white clean suits emerged from different buildings, all converging on her position with that same mechanical stride. She reached her truck, climbed into the cab and slammed the door. Her hands shook as she released the brake and shifted into gear. The Kenworth lurched forward, tires spinning on ice before catching traction. Patricia hit the accelerator, not caring about the load, not caring about anything except getting away from this nightmare place. The access road unwound beneath her wheels. She glanced in her mirrors, seeing the facility receding behind her, those orange sodium lights glowing through the snow. The figures in white clean suits stood at the edge of the property, watching her flee, making no attempt to follow beyond some invisible boundary. Patricia reached the county road and turned east, toward Miles City, toward civilization, toward anywhere that wasn't here. She drove for 30 minutes, her heart rate slowly returning to normal. When she finally checked her fuel gauge, it read exactly half full, the same level it had shown before the malfunction. Her GPS was working perfectly now, showing her position on the county road with no flickering or errors. On impulse, Patricia stopped and pulled up a satellite view of the area she'd just left. The screen showed empty ranch land, no buildings, no facility, no access road, just open fields and scattered trees. She zoomed in, increased the resolution, searched every inch of ground within 5 miles. Nothing. The facility didn't exist, at least not on any map available to civilian GPS satellites. Patricia delivered her pharmaceuticals to Billings, then immediately drove back to the location in daylight. She found the turnoff from the county road. She was certain it was the same place, but the access road was gone. There was only a cattle gate and a rutted dirt track leading into empty fields. No buildings, no sodium lights. No evidence that a massive research facility had ever existed. She never told her dispatcher what happened. She never filed an incident report. But Patricia Sullivan quit long-haul trucking 3 months later and took a local delivery job where she was home every night. She still drives past that stretch of county road sometimes during daylight hours looking for some sign of the facility. And on winter nights when the snow falls heavy and thick, she wonders about those figures in white, clean suits, what they were doing in that impossible laboratory, and what would have happened if she hadn't run. Some facilities don't exist on any map because they're not meant to be found. And sometimes the only way to survive is to escape and never look back, carrying the memory of things that cannot be explained, only endured and feared. Story number 3, The Hitchhiker Who Knew Too Much. Marcus Webb had a simple rule: never pick up hitchhikers. In 17 years of driving long-haul routes across the American South, he'd seen enough weird situations to know that stopping for strangers was asking for trouble. So when he saw the man standing on the shoulder of Interstate 20 in western Louisiana during a thunderstorm in August of 2021, his first instinct was to keep driving. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the way the man stood perfectly still in the pouring rain, not waving for help, not even looking at the passing traffic. Maybe it was the fact that this stretch of I-20 was notoriously dangerous, with narrow shoulders and aggressive drivers, and leaving someone stranded felt like condemning them to death. Or maybe it was something deeper, some intuition Marcus couldn't articulate. Whatever the reason, he pulled his Freightliner onto the shoulder and hit the air brakes. The man approached the passenger door and climbed up without being invited. He was soaking wet, his clothes plastered to his thin frame, but his face was oddly dry, as if the rain simply avoided touching him above the neck. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with graying hair and eyes that were an unsettling pale blue, almost colorless. He settled into the passenger seat and looked at Marcus with an expression of mild curiosity. "Appreciate the ride," the man said. His voice was soft, cultured, with no particular regional accent. "You're Marcus Webb. You're hauling paper products from Shreveport to Atlanta. You have a daughter named Caroline who just started college at Georgia Tech. You stopped for me because you saw your father in my face." Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "How do you know my name? How do you know about my daughter?" "I know many things, Marcus. I know you served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat engineer. I know you have exactly $47,000 saved for Caroline's education. I know your ex-wife Sarah lives in Macon with her second husband, a dentist named Peter who Caroline secretly dislikes. And I know that in approximately 42 miles, if you don't take the next exit, you're going to die in a collision with a propane tanker that's currently experiencing brake failure." Marcus slammed on his brakes, pulling back onto the shoulder in a screech of rubber and air. His heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding his system. "Get out! Get out of my truck right now!" The hitchhiker didn't move. "If I get out, Marcus, you'll keep driving. You'll ignore my warning because you think I'm insane or dangerous or both. In 42 miles, you'll round a curve near the Shreveport Road exit and find that propane tanker jackknifed across both lanes. You won't have time to stop. Your truck will impact at 67 miles per hour. The resulting explosion will be visible from the Monroe Airport, 12 miles away. 3 other vehicles will be destroyed. 9 people will die, including you. Your daughter will receive notification 2 hours after her calculus class on her first day of lectures." The rain hammered on the cab roof. Lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the man's pale eyes. Marcus tried to speak, but his throat was closed with fear. This wasn't possible. People couldn't know the future, couldn't describe events that hadn't happened yet with specific detail. Unless they could. Unless this man was something else entirely. "Who are you?" Marcus managed to ask. "A hitchhiker you picked up on Interstate 20. Nothing more. Nothing less." "The question isn't who I am, Marcus. The question is whether you'll believe me in time to save your life and the lives of 8 other people." Marcus stared at the empty highway ahead, rain streaming down his windshield in sheets. Every instinct told him to throw this man out and continue his route. But that voice, those specific details about his life that no stranger should know, kept him paralyzed with uncertainty. "Prove it," Marcus said. "Tell me something that's about to happen, something I can verify." The hitchhiker checked a watch that Marcus hadn't noticed before, an old-fashioned timepiece with hands and numbers. In 3 minutes and 12 seconds, a silver Honda Accord will pass us traveling east. Louisiana plates, Hotel Delta Papa 8274. The driver is a woman named Rachel Torres, age 34. Returning from visiting her mother in Shreveport, she's speeding 15 miles over the limit. In 7 miles, she'll be pulled over by State Trooper Harrison, who is currently parked behind the mile marker 157 sign waiting for speeders. The traffic stop will be routine. She'll receive a warning, not a ticket, because Trooper Harrison went to high school with Rachel's older brother. Marcus watched his side mirror. The highway behind him was empty, just rain and darkness. 60 seconds passed. 90 seconds. At exactly 3 minutes and 12 seconds, a silver Honda Accord roared past, moving fast, its license plate briefly visible in his running lights. Hotel Delta Papa 8274. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered. Not Christ, just someone who can see the roads ahead more clearly than you can. Now, Marcus, you need to make a decision. Take the next exit. Proceed north on State Route 557 for 18 miles, then rejoin I-20 at the Cheniere exit. The detour will add 40 minutes to your journey, but you'll arrive in Atlanta alive. Your daughter will call you tonight, excited about her first day. You'll tell her you love her, and she'll say it back, something she doesn't do often enough anymore. Marcus's hands trembled on the wheel. The logical part of his brain screamed that this was insane, that he was being manipulated by someone with access to personal information. Maybe a scammer who'd hacked his company files or social media accounts. But another part, the part that had kept him alive through 2 combat tours and 17 years on dangerous highways, told him to listen. He shifted into gear and started driving. 5 miles ahead, he took the exit onto State Route 557, a 2-lane county road that wound through pine forests and past scattered houses. The hitchhiker sat silent in the passenger seat, watching the rain. They drove north, following the route exactly as described. 18 miles later, they rejoined I-20 at the Cheniere exit. Marcus checked his mirrors, saw the empty eastbound lanes stretching ahead. Where's the accident? Where's the propane tanker? 42 miles west of here, blocking the highway exactly where I said it would be. By taking the detour, you simply avoided being there when it happened. In about 10 minutes, you'll hear the sirens. Emergency services responding. 9 people survived tonight, Marcus, because you chose to listen. As if summoned by his words, the distant wail of sirens drifted through the storm, multiple vehicles converging on some emergency to the west. Marcus felt his stomach clench. He grabbed his phone and pulled up a traffic app. A huge red indicator marked I-20 westbound, right where he would have been if he'd continued straight. Major incident, all lanes blocked, expect significant delays. I don't understand, Marcus said. How is this possible? How can you see the future? I don't see the future, Marcus. I see probabilities, pathways, the branching roads of choice and consequence. Most people experience time as a single line, moving from past to present to future. I experience it as a map, all possible routes laid out simultaneously. It's not a gift, it's a curse. I see every accident that will happen, every death, every moment of suffering, and I can only intervene in tiny ways. A warning here, a detour there. Small course corrections that save a few lives while millions of others play out their predetermined fates. Why me? Why did you choose to save me? The hitchhiker turned those pale eyes on Marcus, and for the first time, something like emotion flickered across his face. Because your daughter Caroline will become a civil engineer. In 12 years, she'll design a bridge support system that prevents a catastrophic collapse during a hurricane, saving 834 lives. In 23 years, she'll mentor a student named David Chen, who will revolutionize earthquake-resistant construction, saving tens of thousands more. Your life is a small thread in a vast tapestry, Marcus, but it's a thread that leads to beautiful patterns. I couldn't let it be cut tonight. They drove in silence for several miles. Marcus's mind churned with questions, implications, philosophical tangles he couldn't begin to unravel. Finally, as they approached the outskirts of Monroe, the hitchhiker spoke again. "You can let me out here. The danger has passed." Marcus pulled into a rest area, his hands still shaking. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. He turned to look at his passenger, trying to memorize that strange face, those colorless eyes. "Will I see you again?" "No. Our paths only intersect once, but Marcus, remember this night. Remember that the choices we make ripple forward in ways we can't imagine. Be kind to Caroline. Be patient. She's struggling with the pressure of college, questioning whether she chose the right major. Tell her that building things, creating structures that last is noble work. Tell her you're proud. Those words will matter more than you know." The hitchhiker opened the passenger door and stepped down into the drizzle. He walked across the rest area parking lot, moving between rows of trucks, and vanished into the darkness. Marcus sat alone in his cab, listening to the rain, trying to process what had just happened. He completed his delivery to Atlanta the next morning. That night, Caroline called, and Marcus told her exactly what the hitchhiker had said. She cried, told him she loved him, admitted she'd been thinking about dropping out. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Years later, Marcus would remember it as the moment they rebuilt their relationship, the moment Caroline found her direction. Marcus never picked up another hitchhiker. He didn't need to. The man with pale eyes had given him everything he needed: a second chance, a daughter's future, and the knowledge that sometimes the impossible breaks through into our ordinary world for reasons we can barely comprehend. The propane tanker accident was real. Marcus confirmed it through news reports. 9 people survived because of a detour suggested by a stranger who knew too much. Some encounters can't be explained, only accepted with gratitude and wonder, carried like talismans against the darkness that waits along every highway, in every choice, in every moment where fate hangs balanced on the edge of decision. Story No. 4. The Cargo That Listened. Thomas Brennan picked up the sealed container at a distribution center in Portland, Oregon on a clear morning in September of 2024. 29 years of professional driving had taught him not to ask too many questions about sealed cargo, especially when the paperwork listed the contents as research materials with half a dozen special handling instructions. The pay was double his normal rate for the Seattle to Boise run, which meant someone wanted discretion along with delivery. Thomas could provide both. The container was smaller than he'd expected, about the size of a refrigerator made of brushed steel with no visible seams or openings. It sat in the center of his trailer, secured with specialized straps that the loading crew had installed with unusual care. The manifest warned against temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic interference, and unnecessary verbal communication in proximity to cargo. That last instruction struck Thomas as odd, but he'd seen weirder requirements on government contracts. He signed the paperwork, secured the trailer doors, and headed southeast on I-84. The first 3 hours were uneventful. Thomas made good time through the Columbia River Gorge, his Volvo eating up miles while classic rock played on the radio. The sealed container sat silent in the trailer behind him, just another piece of freight to deliver on time. He stopped for fuel in Pendleton, checked his straps, and continued into the high desert country of eastern Oregon. That's when he first heard it. A sound so faint he thought he'd imagined it, a whisper that seemed to come from inside his own head rather than through his ears. Thomas turned down the radio, listening. Nothing. He turned it off completely. Silence, except for the rumble of his engine and the whisper of wind past his mirrors. Then he heard it again, clearer this time. A voice soft and distant, speaking words he couldn't quite understand. Thomas grabbed his CB microphone. Breaker 19, this is Nighthawk westbound on 84. Anyone else hearing weird radio interference? Sounds like crosstalk or something. A trucker responded immediately, a woman with a Texas accent. Negative, Nighthawk. My channels are clear. What kind of interference? Like voices, but real faint. Probably just my radio acting up. Could be alternator noise if your ground wire's loose. Might want to check that at your next stop. Thomas thanked her and hung up the mic. But he knew it wasn't alternator noise. The voices were getting clearer, multiple speakers talking over each other in urgent, clipped sentences. And they were coming from the trailer, from that sealed steel container. He pulled onto the shoulder and climbed out of the cab. The afternoon sun beat down on empty highway, stretching to distant mountains. Thomas walked back to the trailer and pressed his ear against the door. The voices were definitely inside, a confused babble that rose and fell in waves. He tried to make out individual words, but couldn't. The language sounded like English, but wrong somehow, as if spoken backward or with syllables in the wrong order. Thomas returned to the cab and called his dispatcher. Hey Jerry, I need some information about this Portland pickup. What exactly am I hauling? Hold on, let me check the manifest. Says here research materials for the Cascade Institute, some kind of communication device, experimental prototype. Why? Because it's making noise, like it's active or something. Jerry's voice got serious. Did you open the container? No. Definitely not. Good, don't. The special instructions say to deliver sealed. If the cargo's active, that's between the shipper and receiver. Just get it to Boise, Thomas. You're getting paid too much to ask questions. Thomas knew Jerry was right, but the voices bothered him. They continued as he drove, growing gradually louder. By sunset, he could make out occasional words. Resonance, frequency, pattern, observer. The voices had a desperate quality, like people trying to communicate through layers of static and distance. He stopped for the night at a truck stop near Ontario, Oregon, parking in a far corner away from other vehicles. Thomas tried to sleep in his cab, but the voices made it impossible. They were inside his head now, clear as if speakers had been installed in his skull. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all talking at once, describing things he couldn't see. Subject exhibits standard neural architecture, synaptic patterns consistent with mammalian consciousness, limited awareness of quantum substrate. Recommend continued observation. The cargo isn't making noise, Thomas said to the darkness. It's reading my mind. As if in response, the voices shifted, focusing. Subject demonstrates recognition. Awareness threshold exceeded. Intervention may be required. Thomas's hands were shaking. He climbed out of the cab and stared at the trailer, a rectangular shadow in the orange glow of parking lot lights. Whatever was in that sealed container, it was analyzing him, studying him, reporting findings to some audience he couldn't perceive. The voices weren't coming from speakers or radio waves. They were thoughts, communications happening on a level below normal reality, and somehow he could hear them. He opened the trailer doors. The sealed container sat exactly where it had been secured, bathed in the dim light of his flashlight. Thomas approached it slowly, one hand extended, not sure what he intended to do. Touch it, open it, destroy it? The voices rose to a crescendo. Subject approaching interface unit, physical contact imminent, recommend full sensory bridge initialization. Thomas's fingertips brushed the brushed steel surface. The world exploded into light and sound and sensation beyond anything human senses were designed to process. He was standing in his trailer, looking at himself touching the container. He was also standing in a laboratory filled with incomprehensible equipment, looking at screens displaying his brain activity in real time. He was also floating in a void filled with geometric patterns that shifted and pulsed with meaning. looking at himself from a perspective that existed outside normal space-time. The voices resolved into a single presence, vast and incomprehensible, speaking directly into his consciousness. "We apologize for the discomfort. The communication device was not supposed to activate during transport. Your neural patterns triggered an automatic response. We are observing your species, studying the emergence of consciousness in biological systems. Most humans cannot perceive our monitoring equipment. You are an exception, what we call a resonant observer. Your brain processes information at frequencies that overlap with our technology." Thomas tried to speak but had no mouth, no body, only awareness floating in the geometric void. "What are you?" "We are researchers from a dimensional substrate adjacent to yours. Your species describes us in various ways: angels, aliens, spirits, observers. All descriptions are incomplete. We exist in the spaces between your atoms, in the quantum foam that underlies matter. We have been studying Earth for what you would call centuries, watching your evolution, cataloging your development." "Why? What do you want from us?" "Understanding. Your form of consciousness is unique in our experience, arising from biological chemistry rather than dimensional mathematics. We are trying to comprehend how awareness emerges from meat, from electrical signals in neural networks. The communication device you are transporting is part of a monitoring network. We have thousands of similar devices distributed across your world, hidden in shipping containers, buried in landfills, stored in warehouses. They collect data, and we analyze it." Thomas felt anger cutting through his fear. "You're spying on us, studying us like lab animals." "Yes. Though we do not interfere, we observe only. Your species is protected by protocols established eons ago. We cannot change your timeline, cannot influence your development. We can only watch and learn. Unfortunately, your contact with this device creates a complication. You now possess knowledge that most humans are not meant to have. We must decide how to proceed." The geometric patterns shifted, forming shapes that hurt Thomas's mind to perceive. He felt the weight of attention on him, vast intelligences debating his fate across dimensions he couldn't comprehend. Then, abruptly, he was back in his body, standing in his trailer, his hands still touching the sealed container. The voices were gone. Silence pressed against his ears. Thomas staggered backward, nearly falling out of the trailer. He slammed the doors shut and stood in the parking lot, breathing hard, trying to convince himself it had been a hallucination or dream. But he knew better. The contact had been real. Those beings were real, watching humanity from spaces between the fundamental particles of reality. He climbed back into his cab and sat there until dawn, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except geometric patterns and voices describing human consciousness as if it were a curious phenomenon in their alien laboratory. When morning came, Thomas started his engine and continued toward Boise. What else could he do? The cargo had to be delivered. The job had to be completed. He dropped the sealed container at a nondescript office building on the outskirts of Boise. The receiving dock workers handled it with the same careful attention as the loading crew in Portland. No one mentioned the contents. No one asked if Thomas had heard anything unusual. He signed the delivery confirmation and drove away. Payment deposited automatically into his account. Thomas Brennan completed that run and several more over the following months, but he started paying attention to sealed containers, to cargo with unusual handling instructions, to shipments that paid too much for routes that were too simple. He began noticing them everywhere: small steel boxes in trailers, crates in warehouses, packages in distribution centers. The monitoring network was vast, spread across the transportation infrastructure of the entire nation. He never touched another sealed container. He never again heard those voices. But Thomas knows they're still watching, still studying, observing humanity from dimensions we cannot perceive. And sometimes, late at night on empty highways, he wonders what their final report will say about us, what conclusions they'll draw when their centuries-long research project is complete. Because we are not alone in the universe or even in our own world. We are specimens in a laboratory we cannot see, studied by intelligences we cannot comprehend, carrying their equipment in our trucks and ships and planes, complicit in our own observation. The cargo listens because the cargo is always listening, and there is nowhere we can go that those patient alien eyes are not already watching. Story number 5. The rest stop at mile 247. Denise Crawford had stopped at the rest area on Interstate 80 in western Nebraska dozens of times over her 14 years as a commercial driver. It was a convenient spot about halfway between Omaha and Cheyenne, with clean facilities and decent truck parking. The rest stop sat at mile marker 247, a bland collection of brick buildings and picnic tables that looked exactly like 1,000 other rest stops scattered across the American highway system. But on a cold October night in 2023, Denise discovered that the rest stop at mile 247 wasn't quite what it appeared to be. She pulled in around 2 in the morning, exhausted from a 12-hour push hauling furniture from Chicago to Sacramento. The parking lot was mostly empty, just 3 other trucks scattered across the spaces designated for commercial vehicles. Denise chose a spot at the far end, away from the others, where she could get some sleep without being disturbed by engines starting or other drivers moving around. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Rest stops are never completely quiet. There's always ambient noise from the interstate, the hum of idling trucks, the occasional door slamming. But this place was silent in a way that felt unnatural, oppressive. Denise could hear her own heartbeat, the rustle of her jacket, nothing else. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. She locked her cab and walked toward the restroom building, her boots echoing loudly on the pavement. The overhead lights cast harsh pools of illumination, creating stark shadows that seemed too dark, too absolute. Something about those shadows bothered Denise, though she couldn't articulate why. They looked wrong, as if they belonged to a different time of day, a different angle of light. The restroom was empty and spotless, tiles gleaming under fluorescent tubes. Denise used the facilities quickly, feeling increasingly uneasy. The mirrors reflected her face with perfect clarity, but when she moved, her reflection seemed to lag, moving a fraction of a second behind her actual motions. She told herself it was fatigue, 14 hours of driving playing tricks with her perception. But she hurried back outside anyway. The parking lot had changed. Denise stopped dead, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. There were now a dozen trucks parked around her, big rigs that definitely hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. And they were old, decades-old models she recognized from her early years in trucking. Peterbilts and Kenworths from the 90s, Freightliners from the early 2000s, all pristine and gleaming as if freshly washed despite the late hour. Denise approached the nearest truck, a red Peterbilt with chrome stacks and classic styling. The company logo on the door was faded but legible. Morrison Freight. She knew that name. Morrison Freight had gone bankrupt in 2008, its entire fleet auctioned off. So why was one of their trucks sitting here looking like it had just rolled off a dealer lot 15 years ago? A figure climbed down from the Peterbilt's cab. A man, heavyset, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt with a gray beard and tired eyes. He looked at Denise with an expression somewhere between curiosity and resignation. "First time?" he asked, his voice rough with decades of cigarettes and highway dust. "First time for what?" Denise replied, her hand moving unconsciously toward the pepper spray on her belt. "First time getting caught at 247. Don't worry, you're safe enough. We all are, in a way." He gestured at the other trucks. "We're all here for the same reason. We stopped at this rest area and couldn't leave. Denise felt her stomach clench. What do you mean, couldn't leave? I mean, we're stuck, trapped. This place is a loop, a glitch, a pocket of broken time. You can drive out onto the interstate, but you always end up back here at mile marker 247. Some of us have been trying to escape for years, hell, decades. Other drivers were emerging from their trucks now, a dozen figures with hollow eyes and expressions of weary acceptance. They ranged in age from 20 to 70, men and women, representing every era of trucking from the early 90s onward. They gathered around Denise like ghosts, studying her with the interest of prisoners seeing a new inmate. An older woman stepped forward, thin and weathered, wearing a company jacket from a carrier Denise knew had shut down in 2003. I'm Margaret Spencer. I stopped here in July of 2001, been here ever since, watching the same night repeat over and over. What year is it out there now? 2023, Denise said numbly. Margaret's face crumpled. 22 years. Jesus, I have grandchildren I've never met. The bearded man from the Peterbilt spoke again. I'm Ray Sullivan, got trapped in 2011. We've tried everything to get out. We drive out onto the interstate, but within 5 miles we hit a wall, the invisible barrier that turns us around. We're stuck in a radius centered on this rest stop, and no matter what we do, we always end up back at mile marker 247. Denise wanted to run, to get in her truck and drive as fast as possible away from these haunted people and their impossible story. But another part of her, the part that had survived 14 years on dangerous highways, told her to stay calm and gather information. Why? She asked. What makes this place special? Why are we trapped? A younger man spoke up, maybe 30 years old, wearing a t-shirt from a company Denise had never heard of. We think it's because of what's buried underneath. Back in the 50s, this whole area was used for testing, nuclear and chemical experiments. The government buried radioactive waste all through here, unmarked sites that don't appear on any official records. Something they buried under this rest stop, some experiment that went wrong. It created an anomaly, a place where time doesn't flow normally. Margaret added, We're not sure if we're experiencing the same night over and over, or if we're somehow displaced from normal time, existing in a bubble. The sun never rises here. It's always 2:13 in the morning forever. Our trucks never run out of fuel. Our bodies don't age, don't need food or sleep, though we feel the urge for both. We're caught in amber, preserved like insects, watching the same dark parking lot for years or decades while the real world moves on without us. Denise checked her watch. The digital display showed 2:13 a.m., exactly as Margaret had said. She looked at her fuel gauge through the cab window. Still 3/4 full, the same level it had shown when she pulled in. Her phone had no signal, the screen frozen on the AT&T logo, searching endlessly for towers that might as well be in another dimension. There has to be a way out, Denise said, fighting down panic. People must have reported this. The highway patrol, the state police, someone must know. Ray shook his head. From their perspective, nothing's wrong. We see other vehicles on the interstate sometimes driving past at normal speed, but they can't see us. This parking lot is invisible to them, or maybe they see it empty. We've tried flagging them down, standing on the roadway, even throwing things at passing cars. Nothing. We exist in a version of the rest stop that's slightly out of phase with normal reality. One of the other drivers, a woman with short gray hair, spoke quietly. Some of us have given up trying to escape. We just sit in our trucks waiting, hoping that whatever created this anomaly will eventually fade or break. Others keep driving out and hitting that invisible wall over and over, refusing to accept that we're trapped. And a few have walked away from their trucks, wandered off into the fields beyond the rest stop, and never come back. We don't know what happens to them. Denise spent the next subjective hours talking with the trapped drivers, learning their stories, understanding the scope of the nightmare. They came from all over, representing different carriers and different years, united by the bad luck of stopping at mile marker 247 during whatever window of time the anomaly was active. Some had families waiting for them, police investigations into their disappearances that would never find answers. Others were loners with nobody to miss them, which made their situation both easier and more tragic. As they talked, Denise noticed something the others hadn't mentioned. The shadows in the parking lot were moving, slowly, imperceptibly, as if whatever force maintained this loop wasn't quite perfect. The angle of light was changing, degree by degree, suggesting that time was passing just incredibly slowly. She pointed this out to Ray. "I've noticed that too," he admitted. "I've been mapping the shadow movements for years, trying to calculate the time dilation ratio. Best guess, 1 second passes out in the normal world for every hour we experience in here. That's why rescue never comes, why the authorities never investigate. From their perspective, we just stopped at a rest stop and left immediately. Only a few seconds passed. They have no reason to think anything's wrong. But eventually, when we don't show up at our destinations, eventually they'll look for us, but we won't be here. In their time frame, this whole thing plays out in minutes. We arrive at the rest stop, get trapped in the anomaly for what feels like years to us, and then either escape or vanish. From the outside, it looks instantaneous." Denise felt hope stirring. "So there is a way out. If people eventually escape or vanish, that means the trap isn't permanent." Margaret's expression was grim. "Some escape. We don't know how or why, they just wake up one morning, drive onto the interstate, and don't come back. We assume they broke through, got back to normal time, but most don't. Most of us stay trapped until we fade away, our existence here becoming too attenuated to maintain. That's what happened to the walkers, I think. They stretched themselves too thin, moving too far from the anchor point, and just dissolved into nothing." Denise returned to her truck and sat in the cab, trying to think clearly. She was a practical woman, a problem solver, not given to panic or mysticism. There had to be a logical explanation, a scientific principle underlying this nightmare. Time dilation suggested gravity, massive gravitational fields that bent space-time. If radioactive waste was buried under the rest stop, and if some exotic material or reaction had created unusual gravitational effects, it might explain the temporal anomaly, but understanding it didn't help her escape it. She tried driving out. The interstate looked normal, other vehicles passing in both directions at highway speeds. But as Ray had warned, within 5 miles, Denise hit something she couldn't see or understand. Her truck simply stopped responding to her controls, turned itself around, and drove back to mile marker 247. She tried it 3 more times with the same result, until despair threatened to overwhelm her. Back in the parking lot, Margaret found her sitting with her head in her hands. "I know what you're feeling. We all went through it. The denial, the anger, the attempts to logic your way out. Eventually you accept it. This is where we are now. This is what we've become. Ghosts haunting a rest stop, waiting for release that might never come." "No," Denise said fiercely. "I won't accept it. My daughter is 15. She needs me. I'm not going to abandon her to become one of your parking lot ghosts." "Then what will you do differently? What makes you think you can escape when none of us have?" Denise didn't have an answer. But she knew she had to try something, anything, rather than surrender to the slow dissolution that had claimed so many of the trapped drivers. She spent subjective days studying the anomaly, measuring shadow movements, mapping the invisible boundary, looking for any weakness or variation. And slowly a theory began to form. The anomaly wasn't constant. It pulsed, strengthening and weakening in cycles that corresponded to something Denise couldn't quite identify. She timed the cycles carefully, noting that every few subjective days the shadows moved slightly faster. The air felt slightly different, as if the grip of the temporal distortion loosened for brief periods. If she could time an escape attempt to coincide with one of those weak points, maybe, just maybe, she could break through. She shared her theory with Ray and Margaret. They were skeptical but willing to help. Together they calculated the next weak point and prepared. When the moment came, Denise started her engine, said a prayer to any god that might be listening, and drove onto the interstate. This time she didn't try to fight the invisible force turning her around. Instead, she accelerated into it, pushing her truck to maximum speed, treating the barrier like a physical obstacle she could break through with sheer momentum. The world blurred around her. Reality twisted, shadows stretching into impossible shapes. Denise felt her consciousness fragmenting, spreading across multiple timelines simultaneously. She was driving on I-80 in 2023. She was parked at the rest stop with the ghosts. She was everywhere and nowhere, stretched across the boundary between trapped and free. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, she broke through. The blur resolved into normal highway, normal traffic, normal time. Denise checked her mirrors and saw the rest stop receding behind her, looking completely ordinary in the pre-dawn darkness. Her dashboard clock showed 2:17 a.m., 4 minutes after she'd originally pulled in. 4 minutes that had felt like days. She drove to the next town and called her dispatcher, reported a mechanical issue that had delayed her slightly. Nobody questioned it. Nobody knew she'd been trapped in a temporal anomaly, been surrounded by ghost drivers from decades past. She completed her delivery to Sacramento and returned home to her daughter, holding her tight, grateful for every moment of normal linear time. Denise Crawford never stopped at the rest area at mile marker 247 again. She warns other drivers away from it when she can, though most ignore her, thinking she's superstitious or paranoid. And sometimes late at night she thinks about Ray and Margaret and all the others still trapped there, experiencing the same frozen moment over and over, waiting for release. She hopes they eventually escaped, broke through as she did. But she suspects many of them are still there, ghosts driving ghost trucks in a parking lot that exists outside normal time, their families having given them up for dead long ago. Some places should not exist, should not be possible under the laws of physics as we understand them. But they do exist, hidden in plain sight, waiting for unlucky travelers to make one wrong stop at exactly the wrong moment. The rest stop at mile 247 is one of those places, and it's still out there, still trapping the unwary, a pocket of broken time that the highway maps don't show and the authorities don't acknowledge. Drive carefully and choose your rest stops wisely, because some roads lead to places you can never escape. Story number 6, The Convoy of Shadows. Gerald Montez had been hauling freight down Interstate 10 through West Texas for 26 years when he encountered the convoy that shouldn't exist. It happened on a moonless night in March of 2022, somewhere between Fort Stockton and Van Horn on one of the loneliest stretches of highway in the continental United States. Gerald was running empty, deadheading back to El Paso after dropping a load of construction equipment in San Antonio. The highway was deserted, as it often was this time of night, just an endless black ribbon cutting through desert that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Around midnight, Gerald saw lights in his mirrors. Not surprising, other trucks used this route regularly. But these lights were odd. Instead of the standard white headlights and marker lights, these glowed with a faint blue-white luminescence, like phosphorescent paint or bioluminescence. Gerald watched in his mirrors as the lights grew closer, resolving into a convoy of trucks, 5 or 6 vehicles traveling in tight formation. As they passed him, Gerald got a better look. The trucks were old, incredibly old styles from the 1950s and 60s. Cab-over designs with rounded fenders and chrome trim, the kind of rigs you only saw in museums or antique shows. But these weren't restored show trucks. They looked operational, moving at highway speed, though Gerald couldn't hear their engines. In fact, he realized with growing unease he couldn't hear anything from them at all. No engine rumble, no wind noise, no tire sounds. They passed in complete silence, glowing with that eerie blue light. The lead truck had lettering on its door. Redstone Hauling, Carlsbad, NM. Gerald knew that name. Redstone Hauling had been a major carrier back in the atomic age, specializing in government contracts. They'd gone bankrupt in 1968 after a scandal involving unsafe handling of radioactive materials. Several of their drivers had died from radiation exposure. The company records had been sealed by federal order. As the convoy passed, each truck became visible in Gerald's headlights for a moment. All of them bore the Redstone Hauling logo. All of them looked decades old, yet perfectly maintained, and all of them were driven by figures who sat unnaturally still behind their wheels, silhouettes that didn't move or react to Gerald's presence. The last truck in the convoy slowed, matching Gerald's speed, running parallel in the left lane. Gerald looked over and saw the driver turn to face him. The man's features were indistinct, blurred as if viewed through frosted glass, but Gerald could make out enough detail to see that something was wrong with the driver's face. The skin looked mottled, discolored, with patches that glowed faintly. The driver raised one hand in a slow wave, and Gerald saw that the hand was skeletal, bones visible through translucent flesh. Gerald's foot hit the accelerator instinctively, his freightliner surging forward, but the convoy matched his speed easily, staying alongside him. The ghost driver kept waving, that slow, deliberate gesture that might have been greeting or warning. Then the convoy began to accelerate, pulling ahead of Gerald, their blue-white lights receding into the distance. Within a minute, they vanished completely, leaving Gerald alone on the empty highway with his heart pounding and his hands shaking on the wheel. He tried his CB radio. Breaker 19. This is Desert Ghost, westbound on I-10 near mile marker 153. Did anybody else see those trucks that just passed? The old ones with the weird lights? Static answered him. Gerald tried several more times but got no response. Either no other trucks were in range, or nobody was willing to admit they'd seen what he'd seen. He considered calling the highway patrol, but what would he say? That he'd been passed by ghost trucks from a company that went bankrupt 50 years ago? They'd think he was drunk or hallucinating. Gerald drove another 20 miles trying to calm down, telling himself it had been a trick of lighting or fatigue. But deep down, he knew what he'd seen was real. Then, rounding a curve, he saw them again. The convoy was stopped on the shoulder, all 6 trucks parked in a line, their blue-white glow casting eerie illumination across the desert scrub. Every instinct told Gerald to keep driving, to put as much distance as possible between himself and those impossible vehicles. But another part of him, the part that had made him a successful trucker for over 2 decades, wanted answers. He slowed down, pulled onto the shoulder about 100 yards past the convoy, and stopped. For a long moment, Gerald just sat in his cab, engine idling, watching the ghost trucks in his mirrors. Nothing moved. The drivers remained frozen behind their wheels. Then, one by one, the cab doors opened. The drivers climbed down, 6 figures in old-fashioned work clothes, moving with jerky, stuttering motions like film played at the wrong speed. They walked toward Gerald's truck. Not threatening, not rushing, just walking with that same unnatural gait. Gerald could see them clearly now in his running lights. They were dead, or something close to it. Their flesh was withered, falling away from bones in some places. Their eyes glowed with the same blue-white phosphorescence as their trucks. and they were covered in burns, radiation burns that had never healed, that had somehow been preserved along with their consciousness. The lead driver reached Gerald's truck and looked up at him through the window. This close, Gerald could see the damage was even worse than he'd thought. Half the driver's face was gone, skull visible, but the remaining eye still moved, still focused on Gerald with terrible awareness. "Help us," the ghost driver said. His voice was a whisper, dry as desert wind. "We've been driving this route for 54 years. Can't stop, can't rest. The cargo won't let us." "What cargo?" Gerald managed to ask. The ghost gestured back toward the convoy. "Plutonium cores, weapon components. They were supposed to go to the Nevada test site for disposal. But something went wrong. The containment failed. We were all exposed, all 6 of us. Got sick during the drive. Company told us to keep going, said they'd have medical teams waiting. At the destination, they lied. They just wanted the cargo delivered before we died and created a scandal." Another ghost driver spoke, a woman whose hair had fallen out in patches. "We made it to the test site, delivered the cores, but by then we were too far gone. They put us in a hospital tent, told us help was coming. We died over 3 days screaming, our bodies dissolving from the inside out. They buried us in unmarked graves in the desert. And somehow, we woke up back in our trucks, back on the highway, driving the same route over and over. The radiation did something to us, fused our consciousness with the plutonium, with the cargo. We're bound to it, forced to transport it forever." Gerald felt his stomach churn. "The cargo's still in your trailers?" "In some form, yes. Not physical anymore, but present. We can feel it. Burning, always burning. We drive to the test site, deliver to people who aren't there, then drive back to Carlsbad. Every night the same route for 54 years. We can't deviate, we can't stop. We're prisoners of the road and the radiation, ghosts chained to metal and atoms." A third driver, an older man whose entire left arm was missing, said, "You're the first person who's seen us in decades. Most people drive right past, don't notice us at all. But you saw us clearly. That means you have a connection to death, to the spaces between life and ending. We're asking for your help." "What can I do?" Gerald asked, feeling helpless and horrified. "Tell our story," the lead driver said. "The government sealed the records. Our families were told we died in the accident, given small settlements, never learned the truth. Tell them what happened to us. Tell them we're still here, still suffering. Maybe if enough people know, if the truth comes out, it'll break whatever curse binds us to this highway." Gerald nodded slowly. I'll tell everyone who'll listen." The ghost drivers looked at each other, and for a moment something like relief flickered across their ruined faces. "Thank you," the lead driver whispered. "We've been waiting so long for someone who could see us, someone who would listen. Now at least our suffering will be acknowledged." They turned and walked back to their trucks, that same jerky, stuttering motion. The cab doors closed. Engines started without sound. The convoy pulled back onto the highway and accelerated, blue-white lights fading into the darkness. Within seconds they were gone, leaving Gerald alone with his thoughts and a story that nobody would believe. But Gerald tried anyway. He told his dispatcher, who listened politely and suggested Gerald take some time off for rest. He told other drivers at truck stops, who nodded sympathetically and changed the subject. He tried contacting newspapers, government agencies, anyone who might investigate. Nobody was interested. Ghost trucks driven by radiation victims from a 50-year-old scandal? It sounded like a bad movie. Pitch. Months passed. Gerald couldn't forget those ruined faces, those desperate pleas for acknowledgement. He researched Redstone Hauling, digging through old newspaper archives and government documents. He found confirmation that the company had handled radioactive materials. that they'd lost drivers to mysterious illnesses, that a federal investigation had been abruptly closed in 1968. But nothing about the specific convoy, nothing about 6 drivers who died transporting plutonium cores. Then one night, Gerald was driving the same stretch of I-10, approaching the spot where he'd seen the convoy. His CB radio crackled to life. "Desert Ghost, this is Redstone Lead. We received your message. We know you tried to tell our story. We're grateful, even though nobody believed you. Sometimes just being remembered is enough." Gerald grabbed his microphone. "Are you free? Did it help?" "No. We're still bound, still driving. But now we know someone out there knows our truth, carries our memory. That gives us strength to continue, to endure another 50 years if we must. Thank you, Desert Ghost. Drive safe out there. And if you see other ghosts on the highway, other lost souls trapped by bad luck and corporate greed, tell their stories too. Memory is the only immortality most of us get." The radio went silent. Gerald never saw the convoy again, but he kept his promise. He tells their story at every truck stop, to every driver who'll listen. Most dismiss it as road legend, the kind of tale truckers tell to pass time and scare rookies. But a few listen carefully, and a few of those have seen their own ghost convoys, their own impossible vehicles driven by the dead. There are more of them out there than anyone wants to admit, trapped souls bound to highways by tragedy and radiation and corporate crimes that were never punished. They drive through the darkness, glowing with unnatural light, waiting for someone to see them, to acknowledge their suffering, to remember. Gerald Montez remembers. And now, so do you. Story number 7, The Bridge Between Worlds. Elizabeth Kowalski was hauling electronics from Seattle to Portland on a foggy November night in 2021 when she encountered the bridge that appeared and disappeared. 20 years of professional driving had made her comfortable with Pacific Northwest weather, the dense fogs that rolled in from the ocean and reduced visibility to almost nothing. But this fog was different, thicker, and somehow more alive, swirling with patterns that suggested intelligence or purpose. Elizabeth was on Interstate 5 about 30 miles north of Portland when her GPS started malfunctioning. The display showed her position jumping around erratically, sometimes placing her miles from the highway, sometimes showing her traveling backward. She tried resetting it, but the behavior continued. Then her CB radio picked up a strange broadcast, a voice speaking in a language Elizabeth didn't recognize, all harsh consonants and clicking sounds that seemed impossible for human vocal cords to produce. The fog grew denser, reducing her visibility to less than 20 feet. Elizabeth slowed to 40 miles per hour, her hazard lights flashing, cursing under her breath. This was dangerous, and if a trooper saw her, she'd be ordered off the road until visibility improved. But she was already running late, and the cargo manifest specified time-sensitive delivery. She needed to push through if possible. Then through the fog she saw lights, not the red taillights of other vehicles, but something else, a pattern of blue and green illumination that looked almost decorative. As Elizabeth drew closer, the lights resolved into something that made her press the brake pedal involuntarily. It was a bridge, but like no bridge she'd ever seen. The structure looked organic, grown rather than built, with sweeping curves and textures that reminded her of coral or bone. The blue-green lights were embedded in the bridge itself, pulsing slowly as if with a heartbeat. Elizabeth checked her mental map of I-5. There was a bridge around here somewhere, crossing one of the tributaries that fed into the Columbia River. But it was a standard steel and concrete structure, utterly prosaic. This thing ahead of her was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist on a major interstate highway 30 miles from Portland. Traffic was sparse, just a few vehicles scattered across the northbound lanes. None of them seemed to notice anything unusual. They drove onto the strange bridge without hesitation, their taillights fading into the fog on the far side. Elizabeth watched a minivan pass her, a family vehicle with child seats visible in the rear window. If they could cross safely, maybe it was okay. Maybe Elizabeth was just seeing the normal bridge wrong, her perception warped by fatigue and the disorienting fog. She drove onto the bridge. The transition was immediate and disturbing. The pavement beneath her tires changed texture, becoming smooth and slightly resilient like driving on rubber. The bridge surface gave off a faint bioluminescent glow, that same blue-green color illuminating the fog from below. Elizabeth could see the railing now, and it definitely wasn't made of metal. It looked like polished stone carved with intricate patterns, symbols that might have been writing or purely decorative. The designs hurt to look at, creating optical illusions that made Elizabeth's eyes water. Halfway across the bridge, Elizabeth's dashboard started going haywire. Every gauge spun wildly. Her fuel indicator jumped from half full to empty to beyond full. The speedometer showed she was simultaneously doing 0 and 200 miles per hour. The radio erupted with that alien language again, voices overlapping and arguing in tones that conveyed emotion, even though Elizabeth couldn't understand the words. Then she saw the figure standing in her lane. A man, tall and impossibly thin, wearing what looked like a uniform or formal suit in a style Elizabeth didn't recognize. He held up one hand in an unmistakable gesture. Stop. Elizabeth hit her brakes, her Volvo coming to a halt about 10 feet from the figure. The man approached her driver's side window, moving with a grace that seemed weightless, as if gravity affected him differently. Up close, Elizabeth could see that he wasn't human, or at least not entirely human. His proportions were wrong, limbs too long, fingers with too many joints. His face was beautiful in an unsettling way, features too symmetrical, eyes too large and too dark. When he spoke, his mouth didn't quite sync with the words Elizabeth heard. Traveler, you are using the bridge during designated commercial hours without proper authorization. This is a violation of the Traverse Agreement between your jurisdiction and ours. I must ask you to reverse course and return to your designated timeline. Elizabeth's mind struggled to process this. Timeline? What are you talking about? This is Interstate 5, I'm just trying to get to Portland. The figure tilted his head, a gesture that seemed curious. You are unaware that you have crossed a dimensional boundary? Interesting. The fog must have confused your perceptions. This structure is a transport conduit connecting multiple adjacent realities. Your species does not have access to its full functionality, but occasionally travelers cross over during moments of temporal spatial instability. The fog, in your case, created such a moment. I don't understand, Elizabeth said, though part of her was beginning to. The strange bridge, the malfunctioning instruments, the alien figure, it all pointed to something beyond normal experience, beyond the consensus reality she'd inhabited for 46 years. You have entered a space between worlds, the figure explained patiently. What you perceive as a bridge is actually a transport hub, a junction where multiple timelines intersect. In your reality, this location contains a simple river crossing. But in the true structure of the multiverse, it is a nexus, carefully maintained to allow controlled movement between parallel versions of your Earth. Normally, your kind cannot see or use this nexus. You simply drive across your bridge without awareness of what exists in the same space on different dimensional frequencies. But tonight, due to atmospheric conditions and quantum fluctuations, you became partially shifted, able to perceive the nexus for what it really is. Elizabeth looked past the figure, trying to see what lay beyond the bridge on the far side. The fog was clearing there, and through it she glimpsed something that made her breath catch. It was Portland, but wrong. The city skyline was different, with buildings that didn't exist in her Portland. Architectures that looked half-grown and half-built, structures that defied normal geometry. The river reflected lights and colors she had no names for. And in the streets, visible even from this distance, were figures that might have been human, or might have been something else entirely. "That's not my Portland," Elizabeth said quietly. "Correct. That is Portland 7 Delta, a version of your city that exists in an adjacent timeline where human history diverged from yours approximately 3,000 years ago. If you were to complete your crossing, you would find yourself in a world where the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest developed advanced biotechnology instead of European colonizers introducing industrial technology. Different but not necessarily better or worse, simply other. Can I go back to my timeline, my Portland?" "Of course. Reverse your vehicle. Drive back across the bridge. When you reach the far side, the quantum uncertainty will collapse, and you will return to your original timeline. The bridge will revert to its appearance in your reality, a normal structure of steel and concrete. You will forget most of this encounter, retaining only vague impressions that might manifest as dreams or unexplained unease. This is standard protocol for unauthorized dimensional crossing." Elizabeth started to turn her truck around, a difficult maneuver on the narrow bridge. As she worked the wheel, another thought occurred to her. "You said there's an agreement, a traverse agreement. That means some people from my timeline know about this. They know about the multiverse, the nexus, all of it." The figure's two large eyes focused on her with renewed interest. "Your species has a small number of individuals who are aware of the bridge system, yes. They negotiate passage for authorized travelers, maintain the protocols, ensure that the various timelines remain distinct. It is delicate work. The multiverse is vast, but the threads connecting adjacent realities are fragile. Too much unauthorized crossing, too much contamination between timelines, and the entire structure could collapse." "Who are these people? Government? Some secret agency?" "Many organizations, some official, some hidden. They exist in all the major timelines, working together to maintain stability. If you wish to learn more, if you believe you could contribute to this work, there are ways to make contact. But be warned, knowledge of the multiverse changes a person. Once you truly understand that your reality is one of infinite variations, that every choice and chance creates new timelines branching away forever, it becomes difficult to care deeply about any single outcome. Many who work with the bridges become detached, viewing their original timeline as no more important than any other." Elizabeth completed her turn, her truck now facing back the way she'd come. The bridge stretched ahead, still glowing with that eerie bioluminescence, still covered in those pattern-carved railings. Beyond it, visible through thinning fog, was the highway she knew, the normal world. "I think I'll stick with my own timeline," Elizabeth said. "I've got a delivery to make. Probably best not to complicate things with multiverse entanglements." The figure inclined his head in what might have been respect or approval. A wise choice. Most who accidentally cross choose to return and forget. The few who seek deeper knowledge often come to regret it. "Drive safely, Elizabeth Kowalski. And if you encounter the bridges again, remember that they serve a purpose beyond your comprehension. Respect them, and they will guide you home." Elizabeth drove forward, accelerating as much as she dared on the narrow bridge. The figure watched her pass, unmoving, his two dark eyes reflecting blue-green light. The bridge surface changed beneath her tires, becoming normal asphalt again. The glowing patterns faded. The carved railings reverted to standard steel barriers. Within seconds, Elizabeth was on normal I-5, driving through normal fog toward normal Portland. She checked her dashboard. Everything was working correctly, all gauges reading proper values. Her GPS showed her exactly where she should be, 30 miles north of Portland on I-5. The CB radio was silent except for occasional chatter from other drivers. Elizabeth reached up and touched her face, making sure she was solid, real, still herself. The memory of the encounter was already fading, becoming dreamlike and uncertain. Had she really seen an alien bridge connecting multiple timelines? Had she really talked to a dimensional guardian who looked almost but not quite human? Or had she just experienced a momentary hallucination brought on by fatigue and fog? Elizabeth couldn't be sure, and as she drove, the certainty continued to slip away. She delivered her electronics cargo to Portland on schedule, returned home to Seattle, and resumed her normal routes. But sometimes, on foggy nights, Elizabeth looks at bridges differently, wondering if that steel and concrete is all that's really there. Or if other structures exist in the same space, invisible to most travelers, connecting worlds that never touch. The bridges between realities are real, maintained by organizations that exist in secret, used by travelers most of us never see. And occasionally, when conditions align just right, normal people catch a glimpse of the vast machinery underlying the multiverse, the impossible architecture that holds infinite worlds together. Elizabeth Kowalski glimpsed it once, and though the memory faded to something like a dream, she never entirely forgot. She knows now that reality is far stranger and more complex than the maps and GPS systems suggest, and that every bridge might lead to more than one destination. Drive carefully and pay attention to the fog, because sometimes it reveals truth rather than obscures it. Story number 8, The Voice from the Emergency Channel. Leonard Hayes was making a routine run from Denver to Salt Lake City in April of 2023 when his CB radio picked up a distress call that shouldn't have been possible. Leonard had been driving for 31 years, and in all that time he'd heard plenty of strange things over the CB: pranks, weird conversations, the occasional conspiracy theorist ranting about chemtrails or government surveillance. But nothing like this. It started around 10 at night as Leonard was climbing through the Rockies on I-70, his Peterbilt loaded with manufacturing equipment bound for a factory in Provo. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the thin mountain air, traffic light. Leonard was listening to Channel 19, the standard trucker frequency, half paying attention to chatter about road conditions and a speed trap near Glenwood Springs. Then his radio switched channels on its own. The display jumped from 19 to Channel 9, the emergency frequency that was officially monitored by the FCC and used for genuine emergencies. Leonard frowned and reached to switch it back. But before he could, a voice came through the speaker. A young woman speaking fast, her words tumbling over each other with barely contained panic. "This is Melissa Harrington, driver for West Side Transport. I'm in trouble on I-70 eastbound near Eisenhower Tunnel. My trailer's on fire. I can see smoke. I've got hazardous cargo, chemical solvents. I need emergency services immediately. Is anyone receiving this? I'm at mile marker 216. Repeat, mile marker 216. Please, someone respond." Leonard grabbed his microphone instantly. Years of road brotherhood kicked in, overriding any questions about why his radio had switched channels. "This is Silver Hawk on I-70 westbound near Georgetown. I copy your distress call, Melissa. I'm calling 911 now. What's your exact location and vehicle description?" Static answered him. The woman's voice continued, seemingly not hearing Leonard's response. "The fire's spreading. I can feel the heat in the cab. I have to stop, have to get out. Oh God, it's moving so fast. How did this happen? I just had the truck inspected last week. Everything was fine. Everything was..." The transmission cut off with a sound that made Leonard's blood run cold. Not static, but a roar, explosive and violent, followed by complete silence. Leonard immediately called 911, reported a truck fire near mile marker 216 on I-70 eastbound. The dispatcher took his information calmly, said they'd check on it, thanked him for the report. Leonard kept driving, his mind racing. Mile marker 216 eastbound would put the fire on the opposite side of the highway from where he was currently traveling. He'd be passing that location in about 20 minutes if he maintained his current speed. He switched his CB back to Channel 19 and asked if anyone had seen smoke or a truck fire near Eisenhower Tunnel. Nobody had. Several drivers confirmed they'd been through that area recently and everything looked clear. Confused and concerned, Leonard continued west. When he reached the stretch around mile marker 216, he slowed down and looked across the median at the eastbound lanes. Nothing. No fire, no emergency vehicles, no signs of any incident. Traffic was flowing normally. Leonard grabbed his phone and called 911 again, asked if they'd found anything. The dispatcher checked and said no. State Patrol had investigated the reported location and found no evidence of a fire or disabled vehicle. Leonard thanked her and hung up, more puzzled than ever. He'd clearly heard a distress call. The woman had given specific information: name, company, location, type of cargo. It hadn't sounded like a prank or a drill. The fear in her voice had been genuine. So where was she? What had happened? At his next stop, a truck plaza near Vale, Leonard asked other drivers if they'd heard anything on Channel 9. Nobody had. He checked internet forums, searched for recent truck fires on I-70 and found nothing current. Then, on a whim, he added search terms for older incidents. And there it was, an article from the Denver Post, dated April 2018, exactly 5 years earlier. Truck driver dies in fiery crash near Eisenhower Tunnel. Melissa Harrington, 34, of Grand Junction, Colorado, died Monday night when her tractor-trailer carrying industrial solvents caught fire on I-70. Investigators believe a mechanical failure in the trailer's electrical system sparked the blaze. Harrington radioed for help, but was overcome by smoke and flames before emergency services could arrive. The explosion was visible from 5 miles away. Leonard stared at the article, his coffee growing cold in his hand. He'd heard a recording, an echo, of a woman who died 5 years ago. Her final distress call, somehow preserved and replaying on the emergency frequency, but why? And why had his radio switched channels on its own to pick it up? Over the following weeks, it happened again and again. Always on I-70, always late at night, always his radio switching to Channel 9 without being touched. Leonard heard other distress calls, other voices from the past. A driver named Robert Chen whose brakes failed on Vale Pass in 2015. A woman named Sarah Mitchell who had a heart attack behind the wheel in 2011. A man named James Butler whose truck was struck by a drunk driver in 2003. All of them dead. All of them leaving final transmissions that somehow lingered on the emergency frequency, replaying for anyone whose equipment could pick them up. Leonard started researching the phenomenon. He found scattered reports online, other drivers who'd experienced similar things. The emergency frequencies, particularly Channel 9 on CB and 121.5 MHz for aviation, seemed to sometimes capture final transmissions from people in distress. The prevailing theory shared on paranormal forums and truck driver message boards was that extreme emotion and radio waves could combine in unusual ways. The electromagnetic signature of a person's final moments might somehow be encoded into the frequencies they were using, creating a kind of ghost signal that could be detected by properly tuned equipment. Leonard wasn't sure he believed in ghosts, but he couldn't deny what he was hearing. The voices were real, the distress calls genuine. And they were always from drivers who had died, usually violently, usually calling for help that arrived too late. It was as if their desperate need to be heard, to be saved, had burned itself into the radio spectrum, creating echoes that persisted long after the people themselves were gone. One night, Leonard was driving the same stretch of I-70 when his radio switched channels again. He expected another ghost voice, another echo from a past tragedy. But this time the voice was different, calm, measured, almost serene. Silver Hawk, this is the Frequency Guardian. You've been hearing us, the ones who left messages in the static. We want you to know that we're grateful. Every time someone hears us, every time our final calls are received, it helps. We're caught between neither fully gone nor fully present. But when a living person hears us, acknowledges us, it lessens the weight. It means we weren't calling into void. Someone heard. Someone cared. Leonard's hands tightened on the wheel. Who are you really? Are you ghosts, recordings, what? We are echoes, the voice replied. Impressions left in the electromagnetic field by strong emotion and traumatic death. We are not the people we were, not truly conscious or aware in the way you understand. But we are not nothing either. We are patterns, information, memories encoded into radio waves. And when someone like you receives us, it completes the circuit. It gives our final transmissions meaning. What do you want from me? Leonard asked. Keep listening. Keep acknowledging. You have equipment that can receive us more clearly than most. Your radio, or perhaps something about your own neural patterns, allows better reception of our frequency. By hearing us, by remembering us, you help us fade properly. Every echo needs an audience. Every distress call needs to be received. You are providing that service whether you intended to or not. How many of you are there? Hundreds, thousands. Every driver who died calling for help, every pilot who sent a mayday into empty sky, every sailor who radioed an SOS that went unanswered. We're all here, encoded in the emergency frequencies, waiting to be heard one final time before we can fully disperse. The transmission ended. Leonard sat in silence for a long moment, watching the highway unwind ahead of him. He thought about all the voices he'd heard over the past weeks, all the desperate pleas from the dead, and he made a decision. He would keep listening. He would acknowledge every ghost signal that came through. Because if there was even a chance it helped those poor souls find peace, it was worth the discomfort and fear of hearing their final moments. Leonard Hayes became a collector of ghost transmissions. He documented them, researched the accidents they described, verified that every voice matched a real person who had died in the time and place they described. He started a private database, a memorial of sorts, listing every name, every incident, every final message. Other drivers began sharing their own experiences with him, and Leonard's database grew to include hundreds of ghost signals from across the country. He never spoke about it publicly. The mainstream world had no place for trucker who claimed to hear the dead on his CB radio. But in the tight-knit community of professional drivers, Leonard became known as the man who listened to the voices. Other truckers would contact him when they picked up strange transmissions, and Leonard would add them to his records, offering comfort and context. The voices weren't random, weren't meaningless. They were people who had died badly, leaving their fear and need imprinted on the frequencies they'd hoped would bring salvation. Years passed. Leonard eventually retired, moving to a small house in Colorado near the mountains he'd driven through so many times. But he kept his CB radio, kept it turned to Channel 9, still listening for those ghost voices that came through the static. And sometimes, on clear nights when the atmospheric conditions were right, he heard them. Melissa Harrington calling for help on I-70. Robert Chen reporting brake failure. Sarah Mitchell gasping her last words. All of them speaking into the void, and Leonard Hayes answering, acknowledging, ensuring that their final transmissions were finally received by someone who cared enough to listen. The emergency frequencies are haunted by more than static, and the voices of the dead still call for help, waiting for someone with the right equipment and the compassionate heart to hear them and grant them the peace of being remembered. Story number 9. The Truck Stop That Moved. Vincent Morales had been driving the same route between Tucson and Phoenix for 18 years when the truck stop disappeared. The Flying J at mile marker 194 on Interstate 10 had been Vincent's regular stop for fuel and food since 2006, a reliable way station on the 2-hour run between cities. He knew every pump, every parking space, every cashier by name. So when he pulled off I-10 at mile marker 194 on a hot June night in 2024 and found nothing but empty desert, Vincent thought at first he'd made a mistake. He checked his GPS. Mile marker 194, exactly where the truck stop should be. But there was no Flying J. No buildings, no lights. Just the exit ramp leading to a cracked asphalt loop and then back onto the highway with nothing but saguaro cactus and creosote bushes visible in his headlights. Vincent pulled back onto I-10 confused, wondering if he'd somehow gotten turned around. 5 miles down the highway, he saw another truck with hazard lights flashing, parked on the shoulder. Vincent pulled over behind it and climbed down from his cab. The other driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s wearing a Peterbilt trucker cap, was standing beside his truck looking agitated and confused. "Did you just come from that exit back there?" the man asked as Vincent approached. "Yeah, looking for the Flying J, but there's nothing there." "That's because it's gone. Vanished. I've been stopping there twice a week for 10 years, and tonight it's just gone. Not closed down, not demolished, just gone, like it never existed." "My name's Carl Pennington." Vincent introduced himself and they compared notes. Both of them had crystal clear memories of the truck stop, could describe it in detail with vivid accuracy. Carl even had photos on his phone taken just 3 weeks earlier, showing him filling up at Pump 7 with the familiar Flying J sign visible in the background. He scrolled through his image gallery, laughing nervously, and showed Vincent the proof. But when they looked at the photos, something was terribly wrong. The images showed Carl at a gas pump, but in the background where the Flying J building should have been, there was only empty desert. It was as if the structure had been erased from the digital file, replaced with what should have been there in the vacant landscape. "That's not right," Carl said, his voice cracking. "I remember taking this picture. I remember the Flying J. The pumps were red and blue. There was a subway inside next to the showers. I filled up and bought a sandwich." They called the Flying J corporate number. After being transferred through multiple departments, they finally reached someone who could check construction records. According to the database, there had never been a Flying J location at mile marker 194 on I-10 in Arizona. The company's closest Arizona locations were in Casa Grande and Phoenix, 40 miles in either direction from that spot. "That's impossible," Carl said into the phone, his frustration evident. "I have pictures, I have fuel receipts from my fleet card. I've been stopping there for 10 years. Check your system again." The corporate representative was polite but firm. "Sir, I've looked at our complete construction and acquisition history for Arizona. We've never owned property at that location, never operated a stop there, never even had plans for that location. It's possible you're thinking of one of our other Arizona locations." Carl hung up in anger. He scrolled through his phone again, looking for those receipts he'd mentioned, trying to find some digital proof of his visits. His payment history showed charges at a Flying J, charges that appeared on his statements dated within the past year. But when he checked the location information attached to those transactions, it simply said, "Location unavailable. Records not found." It was as if the truck stop had been surgically removed from the entire digital infrastructure of the world, leaving only ghosts of financial transactions that referenced something that didn't exist. Vincent felt his own certainty wavering. He, Conio, could picture the truck stop vividly in his mind, could mentally walk through its layout. He remembered the worn linoleum in the store, the smell of diesel and coffee, the face of a cashier named David who worked the night shift. But when he tried to remember specific visits, specific dates, the memories became hazy and uncertain. Had he really stopped there hundreds of times over 18 years, or had he just driven past an exit that led nowhere? The harder he concentrated on the memories, the more they felt like they were slipping away, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. "What's happening to us?" Vincent asked, genuine fear creeping into his voice. Carl looked at him with eyes full of dread. "I think the truck stop didn't disappear. I think it was never there. Not in this reality, anyway. Something put false memories in our heads, made us think there was a flying J at mile marker 194. But there never was, and now whatever created those false memories is breaking down, letting the truth show through." They drove together to the next exit, about 15 miles ahead, pulled into an actual truck stop, one that definitely existed and had other drivers fueling and customers in the store. In the bright lights of the parking lot, Vincent and Carl sat in Carl's cab and tried to make sense of what had happened. Carl pulled up internet maps on his phone, satellite views, historical images from multiple sources. Every single source showed mile marker 194 as empty desert, both currently and going back decades. No evidence of construction, no indication that anything had ever been built there. No permits filed, no geological surveys. "Why would something plant false memories of a truck stop?" Vincent asked. "What would be the purpose? What could possibly be achieved?" "I don't know," Carl admitted. "But I'm betting we're not the only ones. There could be dozens of drivers, maybe hundreds, with the same false memories, all thinking they'd been regularly stopping at a flying J that never existed. All confused now because reality doesn't match what they remember." Carl was absolutely right. Over the following weeks, Vincent encountered 4 more drivers who independently mentioned the flying J at mile marker 194, all expressing the same confusion about its sudden disappearance. All of them had vivid memories they couldn't verify. All of them had photos that showed empty desert instead of buildings. All of them had payment history that referenced a location that didn't appear in any official corporate records. Vincent started his own investigation. He contacted academic researchers who studied false memories and collective delusion, psychologists who specialized in confabulation and memory errors, even paranormal investigators from the internet who claimed expertise in dimensional anomalies. One expert, a tenured professor from Arizona State University's psychology department named Dr. Sarah Chen, was particularly interested in his detailed story. "There are documented cases of shared false memories," Dr. Chen explained during an initial phone interview. "The Mandela effect, where large groups of people remember specific details or events that differ significantly from documented reality. People misremember the spelling of famous brand names, remember historical events happening differently. But this is more targeted than that, more specific and localized. You and these other drivers all have nearly identical false memories of the same specific location that provably never existed. That suggests not natural human psychology, but rather external manipulation from some source." "Manipulation by what?" Vincent asked. "Who or what could be powerful enough to implant memories in the minds of multiple people?" "Several possibilities," Dr. Chen said. "Experimental psychological warfare programs testing technology to implant false memories in target populations. Extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings studying human consciousness and perception. Glitches in the simulation if you subscribe to that theoretical framework. Or something we don't have any framework to understand, some natural phenomenon we haven't documented that creates pocket realities or temporary manifestations that leave psychological imprints even after they vanish." Dr. Chen arranged to formally interview Vincent and several other affected drivers. She collected their testimonies, compared details obsessively, looked for patterns and consistencies. What she eventually found was genuinely disturbing. All of the affected drivers had stopped at mile marker 194 during specific nights when atmospheric conditions were extraordinarily unusual. High electromagnetic activity in the area, unusual cloud formations, temperature inversions that created strange optical distortions. It was as if the truck stop only manifested under specific environmental conditions, appearing real enough to create memories and interact with digital devices, then vanishing when conditions normalized. I believe what you encountered was a temporal or dimensional anomaly, Dr. Chen concluded in her final report. A location that exists sometimes but not always, phasing in and out of our consensus reality based on environmental factors we don't fully understand. When you stopped at mile marker 194, you were interacting with a version of that location from an adjacent timeline or parallel dimension, one where the Flying J was indeed built and operated at that exact location. Your memories are real in the sense that the experiences actually occurred, but they occurred in an adjacent timeline, and when that timeline stopped intersecting with ours, the truck stop vanished from consensus reality, leaving only memories that now conflict with documented history. Vincent tried to wrap his mind around the concept. So there's a parallel version of Arizona where that Flying J exists, and somehow we visited it? Essentially, yes. Quantum physics and multiverse theory suggest that multiple versions of reality exist simultaneously, alternate timelines where different choices led to different outcomes. Most of the time, these timelines remain completely separate and distinct. But occasionally, under the right environmental conditions, they overlap. A location might exist in the same physical space across multiple timelines. If the barrier between them becomes thin enough, a person driving could slip from one timeline to the other without fully realizing what happened. You think you're just pulling off the highway for fuel, but you're actually crossing an invisible threshold into an adjacent reality. How do I know I'm in the right timeline now? Vincent asked, genuine anxiety evident. How do I know I didn't get stuck in an alternate version? How do I know this timeline is the real one? Dr. Chen smiled sadly, a gesture that conveyed no reassurance whatsoever. You don't. None of us do. We assume the reality we're experiencing is the true one, the baseline, the original timeline. But there's no way to verify that assumption. For all any of us know, every time you go to sleep, you wake up in a slightly different timeline, close enough to your original that you don't notice the small differences. The Flying J at mile marker 194 just happened to be a big enough difference that you couldn't ignore it, couldn't rationalize it away. Vincent returned to his normal routes on I-10, but he never felt quite the same afterward. He started noticing other small inconsistencies and anomalies. Businesses he thought he remembered that nobody else could verify. Roads that seemed to be in slightly different positions than he recalled. People's faces that looked almost but not quite like he expected them to. Minor details that didn't align with what he thought he knew. Were these real differences actual evidence that he was slipping between timelines? Or was he just hypervigilant now, seeing patterns and anomalies where none existed, pattern matching gone wrong? He never got a definitive answer to any of these questions. The Flying J at mile marker 194 remained permanently absent from all official records and databases, a ghost of a truck stop that existed only in the memories of a small group of confused drivers. But Vincent kept his photos, kept his receipts even though they referenced a location that didn't exist, kept his detailed written notes about the layout and services, a record of something that might have been real in another version of Arizona. And sometimes, driving past mile marker 194 late at night, he saw lights flicker where there should be only darkness, a brief glimpse of buildings and signs materializing for just a moment before everything resolved back into empty desert. He never stopped, never attempted to verify whether the truck stop was returning. The knowledge that his memories didn't match reality was enough. Vincent Morales became a man caught between timelines, forever unsure which reality was actually his own. Story Chapter 10: The Package That Changed Routes. Sophie Rivera had been driving cross-country routes for 19 years when she picked up the package that wasn't supposed to reach its destination. The pickup occurred at a distribution center in Memphis, Tennessee on a Tuesday, in December of 2023. The package was small, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in unmarked brown paper and sealed with red tape. Nothing about it seemed particularly unusual or noteworthy, except that the shipper had paid for expedited delivery and specified that Sophie personally had to sign for it during the pickup process. The signature requirement was unusual enough that Sophie asked the warehouse manager about it. He checked his paperwork and shrugged. No name given, just says the driver needs to acknowledge receipt. Payment was made in cash for overnight delivery to Albuquerque. Arrives Wednesday morning, no matter what. Seems like someone really wanted to make sure this gets there ASAP. Sophie signed the manifest and loaded the small package into the front of her cab instead of the trailer, keeping it where she could monitor it during the drive. The route was straightforward: Memphis to Albuquerque, I-40 all the way across Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and the Texas Panhandle into New Mexico. Approximately 36 hours of driving. Sophie planned to make it in one overnight push with minimal stops, get the package delivered by noon Wednesday, collect the delivery confirmation, and head back east with a regular haul. She departed Memphis at 4 in the afternoon, eating up miles through Tennessee as the sun set behind her. The package sat on the passenger seat, inert and nondescript. Sophie didn't think about it much as she drove, focusing on the road, managing her hours of service, staying alert. Around midnight, somewhere near the Oklahoma border, she noticed something odd. The package had moved. It was now wedged between the passenger seat and the door, despite being in the middle of the seat when she last checked it at her Texarkana fuel stop. Sophie pulled over at a rest area to investigate. She retrieved the package and examined it carefully. Still sealed, still intact, no signs that anyone had tampered with it. She placed it deliberately on the passenger seat again, this time wedging it against the seatbelt mechanism to prevent sliding. She continued driving. 3 hours later, she checked again. The package had moved. It was now on the floor, wedged under the seat. Sophie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the truck's air conditioning. She retrieved the package again, examined it more thoroughly, looking for any sign of how it could have moved on its own. Nothing. The seal remained intact. It was completely impossible for the package to have moved without being deliberately relocated. Sophie grabbed her CB microphone. Breaker 19. This is Red Rider eastbound on I-40, near mile marker 321. Anyone else out here tonight? I need to talk to someone. A trucker named Dale responded somewhere east of her position. Sophie described the situation with the package, trying not to sound paranoid or crazy. Dale listened patiently and then offered a theory. Sounds like you might have picked up something sensitive, Dale said. I've hauled classified government stuff a few times. Sometimes the packages have mechanisms inside them, gyros, pressure sensors, things that help them reorient. Maybe this one's designed to keep moving around, testing to make sure the driver stays alert, stays engaged. It was a plausible explanation, and Sophie latched onto it gratefully. She secured the package in a lockbox in her cab, secured the box to the seat with extra straps, and continued driving. For a while, nothing else unusual happened. She made good time across Oklahoma, the highway relatively clear despite the late hour. Then around 3 in the morning, her GPS started malfunctioning. The display showed her jumping around erratically, sometimes placing her 50 miles north of her actual position, sometimes showing her on completely different highways. Sophie switched the GPS off and relied on her memory of the route, the mile markers, and her instinct. She'd driven I-40 dozens of times. She didn't need electronic guidance. But her odometer started acting strangely, too. The miles seemed to be accumulating faster than they should. She'd pass a mile marker, note it, drive for what felt like 30 minutes, check again and see that she'd traveled 40 miles instead of the 20 or so she expected based on her speed and time. Conversely, sometimes she'd drive for an hour and watch the odometer barely advance, as if the distance itself was becoming negotiable. The package was moving again. Sophie could hear it shifting around in the lockbox despite being secured with multiple straps. A sound like something solid rolling or shifting inside the padded box back and forth, accompanied by a faint humming that Sophie couldn't quite identify. She pulled into a rest area near the Texas border around 4 in the morning, desperate for a break and to investigate the package one final time. In the harsh fluorescent light of the rest stop restroom, Sophie examined the lockbox carefully. It was sealed exactly as she'd left it. The package inside, visible through the clear plastic, appeared undisturbed. Yet she'd clearly heard it moving, heard that strange humming sound. Another driver, a woman about Sophie's age, was also in the rest stop refilling her coffee. They ended up standing next to each other in the small convenience store, and Sophie found herself asking a casual question. You ever have a package in your truck that seemed to move on its own? Or equipment that malfunctioned, like your GPS and odometer both going crazy at the same time? The other driver smiled knowingly. Not packages, but I've had cargo do weird things. Mechanical breakdowns in equipment that worked fine before loading and worked fine after delivery, like whatever was in the trailer was somehow interfering with electrical systems. I learned not to ask too many questions about shipments. Some things are better left unknown. What if you had to deliver it? Sophie asked. If you absolutely had to get it to its destination? I'd get it there however I could, the driver said, and then I'd retire or transfer to a different route. Once you've picked up something that doesn't follow the rules, something that acts like it has its own agenda, keeping it is a bad idea. Sophie returned to her truck with a growing sense of dread. She was committed now. The delivery was due at Albuquerque by noon today, and it was already past 4 in the morning. She had about 7 hours to cover roughly 400 miles across the Texas Panhandle and into New Mexico. It was eminently doable under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. She got back on I-40 and started the final leg of her journey. The package continued its strange behavior, moving within its box despite being secured, producing that faint humming sound. Her GPS remained mostly offline. Her odometer spun wildly, sometimes accurate and sometimes wildly exaggerated. The road itself seemed to be shifting, mile markers appearing out of sequence occasionally, distances expanding and contracting. Sophie realized something around 6 in the morning. The package wasn't just moving, it was redirecting her, subtly influencing the journey, making sure she took specific exits and stayed on specific routes. She tested this theory by intentionally taking a wrong turn onto a county road that paralleled I-40. Within minutes, a road hazard appeared, forcing her to return to the interstate, a massive pothole that threatened her suspension if she struck it directly. She swerved back onto I-40 and stayed there. The package's final destination wasn't Albuquerque. Sophie knew this now with absolute certainty. The package was using her as a delivery mechanism, using her truck and her skills as a driver to reach its actual destination, which was somewhere else entirely, somewhere the package itself was choosing. By 9 in the morning, Sophie had covered the ground from Memphis to the New Mexico border in record time, seemingly in much fewer hours than the mathematics of distance and speed should have allowed. The package was now making a constant humming sound, a vibration that she could feel through the seat of her truck. The lockbox was vibrating in synchronization with it. At the exact moment her GPS display showed coordinates of the Albuquerque delivery address, Sophie heard a sound like shattering glass. The lockbox cracked open along a seam that hadn't existed before. The package split open from the inside, releasing a beam of light that filled the cab of her truck. Sophie felt her consciousness expanding, fragmenting, experiencing multiple realities simultaneously. She was driving her truck on I-40. She was standing in a building made of light and mathematics. She was conversing with beings that existed as pure information. She was understanding something vast and incomprehensible about the nature of reality, time, and existence. And she was forgetting it all simultaneously, the knowledge draining away like water through her fingers. When her awareness returned to normal, Sophie was parked on the shoulder of I-40 just outside Albuquerque. Her cab was empty except for herself. The lockbox and the package were gone. Her delivery confirmation sheet was sitting on the passenger seat, signed and stamped. Delivery completed, recipient unknown. Coordinates verified, Albuquerque Sector 7 red. Sophie drove into Albuquerque and reported the successful delivery. The company paid her without question, and she collected her bonus for on-time delivery. She never asked who the recipient was. She never attempted to verify the delivery address. She returned to Memphis and immediately requested a transfer to local delivery routes, refusing all cross-country assignments. Years later, Sophie never figured out what the package contained, where it actually went, or why it had chosen her as its delivery mechanism. She had vague memories of understanding something profound during that moment of expanded consciousness, but the knowledge wouldn't stick in her head. It was like trying to remember a dream after waking. The harder she tried to grasp it, the faster it evaporated. Occasionally, she'd run into other drivers at truck stops who had similar stories. They'd exchange knowing looks, speak in vague terms about packages that moved on their own, deliveries to locations that didn't appear on maps, cargo that seemed to have agency. They never spoke about it in detail, understanding without words that some experiences couldn't be shared, couldn't be explained, could only be acknowledged between those who had experienced them. Sophie Rivera never picked up another mysterious package. But sometimes on quiet nights she wondered what would happen if she got one again. Would she refuse it? Or would she accept the delivery, trusting that the package knew where it needed to go, that she was part of something larger than herself, something that existed in the spaces between normal reality? She never got the chance to find out. But in her dreams she still hears that humming sound. And in those dreams, she understands everything. When she wakes, only the humming remains, a memory of knowledge she once possessed but can never quite reclaim. The highways hide more than just asphalt and distance. They carry things between places, things with their own agendas, things that use drivers like Sophie Rivera to move through the world, completing deliveries to destinations that exist outside normal space-time. And sometimes the delivery is not the cargo that changes, but the driver